All right, welcome back, everybody, for another Riftbound 101 episode. Today is number 27, and it is Lux in Focus, one of our last three Legends from Origins and Proving Grounds to cover. We only have Annie and I think MF left, which are for next week as we move into Spiritforged. And the episode today is going to change format slightly because I'm going to start talking about lists in their Spiritforged incarnation, right? We're about to have the fourth regional in China tomorrow, and then we're all moving into pre-rifts this weekend, which means that Spiritforged product is going to start circulating, at least from those events. And then next week is full release, which means a lot of these cards are going to be out in the wild, and singles are going to be purchasable if boosters are not accessible, which like that's a whole other topic. But I was trying to figure out which hero, which legend to talk about, and I figured Lux is a pretty good on point, on ramp, because I think it lets me talk about another deck that has been doing somewhat the rounds, Spell Victor, and to talk about the differences between the two decks and what you can use Lux for going forward, and kind of how she's been used up to date. So, same as usual, we're talking about concept, the big pieces, and then we're going to talk about the main differences, I think, between Lux and Victor and different versions of Lux. And then I'm going to talk about an emerging deck list because I think there was just like not a lot of data right now to make a super decisive call about, but I think we have a pretty good direction, and then a budget version of that to get you started with, which I think is probably one of the most competitive budget versions of decks that we're going to see for the next couple of weeks, anyways. So, Lux is out of the Proving Grounds box, which so far has been causing some big issues. I think if you haven't been able to get your hands on that, that's been pretty restrictive. But notably, as of 2 weeks from now, I think the post release Nexus Knight packs are going to start including Proving Grounds champions and champion units and sig spells as part of the rotation. And really, if you're playing Lux, you only want one Lux champion or legend and one of the Lux champion unit. So, hit my mic, which happens when I get excited. So you're going to have more access to this legend going forward. So Lux is in Order in Mind, and quite simply has one of the more flexible abilities I think is going to scale well for a long time. When you play a spell that costs 5 or more, draw 1. So conceivably, Lux wants you to play spells. She wants you to play expensive spells, and she'll give you draw into presumably some kind of win condition that you're going to be able to find. So she kind of tacks on draw to a suite of cards, which I think are not that bad. And it's not inconceivable that Lux is in the same camp as something like Draven, where you're getting a lot of card draw for what you're doing, with the exception being that Draven just gets to draw more because there are more instances of combat happening even early on, whereas Lux will only draw past like turn 2 or so, one additional card a turn, and then maybe two, and very unlikely, but perhaps with some versions of the deck in the future, 3 cards in one turn rotation between you and your opponent. So you can think of her as, drawing maybe 4, 5, or 6 cards a game, largely because you do want the game to go long. So this is an energy curve for what Lux looked like at the last event that she posted at, which was the CCS 25K that just happened last weekend. And realistically, aside from the CCS placement, Lux has been kind of absent since January 1st. So there's only been like 2 recorded Origins events that she's been present at. Notably, China is now on Spiritforged, so there's like less events happening for Origins, period. And what you can notice with this version is that this version of Lux tends to play big spells and small units. So think of it almost like an inverse to what Master Yi's energy curve look like. You want to play, or people did play, small units to hold the field, followed by large units that would clear it out, like Falling Comet or Singularity, Unchecked Power, and then you end the game with like a well-placed Time Warp or something. And you also run Blue Seals in this version of the deck. Now, I'm not really going to be talking about this deck too much because this is how Lux has been played to date, and I think the results have been fine, but not crazy. What I do want to talk about is the newer version of Lux. So you might notice that this version has somewhat different energy curve placement, and especially a gear at 7, which is really the new all-star of Order and Mind decks, Vanguard Armory, which I'm going to talk about. And also only plays 4 units in the main deck and 1 champion. So you only play your yellow Lux, you play 2 card sharps, and you play 2 Jaces. And that's it. The rest of this deck really lives and dies by a ton of spells, some gear to mitigate your energy costs, some gear to hit opponent trash for very specific decks, particularly if you're fighting something like an Aurelia or the Miracle Sibber that we just saw like have a good placement that Randy was playing at Dalian, and then the Vanguard Armory. So really, like, the deck is moving away, much like the Viktor version, from including units as much as possible in favor of even more spells. Noticeably, not all of them 5 or 6, so you are playing kind of a normal controlling early game, followed by, like, you're just slamming on the brakes for your opponent, removing all of their units that you can, but you be careful, and then you, like, end the game by jamming Vanguard Armory and overrunning battlefields with units, and then if you can time warp from 6 to 8, or from 7 to 9, depending on the matchup, then you can win the game. The priorities for this deck are really like completely different than any other deck. They've reduced units almost to 0, and they really are a function of getting Vanguard Armory out early in some cases and maybe jamming some battlefields, but mostly just like papering over some of your power costs by generating some gold. What the deck does run is just a ton of removal, and there are different kinds of it, and how you count it can vary. But you could reasonably say that you're running more than half your deck just as hard removal. And then a lot of those pieces of removal, but some of the other spells as well, just transform into pieces of draw. Now, you would say this is amazing, right? If I can just starve out my opponent with removal and draw, then everything's going to be fine. Well, one of the things that Lux and Spell Victor struggle with is power costs. A lot of the very good yellow removal spells are power consuming, cards like Cull, cards like Hidden Blade, whichever way you're playing it, and cards like Singularity are going to just eat some of your power. And if your opponent is fielding deflect units, you might get stuck in situations where you're just like out of resources, and then they can play more units a turn or draw more cards than you can remove, which is really like the lose state for this game. This deck doesn't lose when your opponent reaches 8 points. This deck loses when you stop being able to control your opponent's development. So, some of the matchups that you might imagine this deck was built for or struggles against are pretty evident, right? This deck is built to prey on Draven. Even then, I would say the Draven matchup is not like a 90-10. It's probably closer to like a 70-30. But you are trying to completely starve them of resources. And realistically, the decks that are starting to do well over the last couple of weeks, decks like the new Ezreal variant, decks like Aurelia, decks like Lux or Viktor, are really decks that just like refuse to play for point early and are trying to starve your opponent's card draw before flipping into like an endgame version where they just overrun them. Against decks like Aurelia or Ornn, or other decks with low unit counts that are protecting them a lot, you need to find like the right combinations of spells. So I've seen matchups where these decks really can't do much, but there's also been on-camera matches where the person draws like double Call the Weak and gets the opponent's Ornn out, and the game's just over because they can't draw anything, right? Or all their spells in their hand are blank. So you have to catch specific game moments when your opponent is tapped out, or when they don't have like multiple Zonias and Guardian Angels out to protect their units. And then lastly, I think the matchup that is really difficult to win with these decks is Rek'Sai in particular. Swarm decks are just going to develop more than you can often deal with, and they're also going to have recurring threats like the Immortal Phoenix, which are going to be like particularly difficult to deal with. And then in particular, I think if you're not on call, cards like the oh my god, I can't remember the name. It's Camel. The orange can't be targeted by spells or abilities card is really difficult for this deck to deal with. It can effectively only deal with it by playing Decree and ramming units into it, overwhelming it with units, or hitting Call the Weak when it's the only thing they have out, which requires some very specific timings, and the deck will struggle into that. So what happens with this deck is that its matchups are either very good or very bad, which means depending on how your Nexus nights go, you might have nights where this deck feels unbeatable, and you might have nights where this deck feels awful. I think for tournaments, evidently somebody got into top 36 with Lux, which is great, but the deck still has, that feast or famine kind of feeling even at those ranges. So just be aware of that. I think you can have a ton of fun with this deck, though, and especially if you're seeing just like rampant Draven and very little like purple green or green orange, you can have like some pretty good nights with this. Key pieces. So this deck, more than most, I think has something that is interesting and a bit of a struggle. It runs removal and it runs cost mitigation as opposed to like your suite of early game and late game units. And then it effectively runs like one finisher. There's technically two if you count Time Warp, but there's really one card in this deck that you want to find at all costs, and you will often try to mulligan for it if you can. So removal comes in two shapes. You've got your hard removal and your soft removal. Hard removal includes cards like Drag Under, Decree, Cull, Hidden Blade, Call the Weak, not Call the Equipment, where you just kill a unit. And in some cases, you're going to have battlefield restrictions, but aside from that, this is the part of the deck that really gets to shut down most middle-sized or large-sized units. I think this is also one of the reasons, more so than the gear hate, that you're seeing decks like Aurora fall out of fashion. This deck can just like eat your game entirely, and it's really hard. Yellow has always been good against Aurora decks, and now even more so. And then you have your soft removal, so spells like Bellows Breath or Wages or Singularity. Singularity's pretty much a hard removal most of the time, but sometimes it won't be if your opponent's units are too big. And then you can use some combinations, for example, like Decree and Bellows Breath turns Bellows Breath into hard removal, and you can remove like 6 units for like 7 and 4 runes burned, but then you're like completely out of gas, and you can struggle a little bit unless you have gold or seals. So this is kind of what happens, right? You're going to cast a lot of spells with costs, with power costs, and if you're casting something like the Bellows Decree combo, or you're like casting back-to-back singularities, you're going to run out of power very, very fast, which is why the deck needs to run cost mitigations. So one of the pieces of cost mitigation is Lux Crown Guard. You want to play Lux earlier rather than later so that you can benefit the most from that extra energy. Lux also theoretically allows allows you to play one turn earlier for double 5-drop spells, which can make a big difference. But then you're also going to need things that pay for power costs. So the newer version tends to run some amount of Seal of Unity, and Card Sharp is going to produce gold, but also cards like Blood Money and Wages of Pain are going to produce gold, which you can use to pay for costs. And in some cases, you can expect your opponents to also play Treasure Hoard as a battlefield, which you can make some use of, even though you do not play it yourself. So we're just trying, one half of your deck is really just like all removal, and the other part of your deck is trying to basically like smooth out the curve so that when you do find your finishers, you can end the game. And your finisher, I think, is quite simply find Vanguard Armory. More than Viktor, Lux really wants to find this card to end the game. And you can still get to play the Jace Vanguard Armory combo. So for people who don't know how this works, you want gold. So you're going to have to cast Blood Money, Wages, or Card Sharp before you cast Jace. And then you cast Jace, you kill one of your own golds, and you can play Vanguard Armory theoretically on like turn 2, at which point you're going to run away with the game unless people are fielding Gear Hate. There is Gear Hate, and red is a plentiful color, so it's not like this is impossible to find, but it's going to put a ton of pressure on the game, and this is really what you're looking for. Either you're going to starve your opponents out and find Vanguard Armory at some point, or you're going to find it early and you're going to play proactively to jam it and then clear the board for your combo to score you all the points. And this is like really, like the deck is built around getting to this and finding this combo. So, battlefields, you're still trying to play asymmetrical battlefields as usual. Aspirants is really like your battlefield, probably as much as it is for Aurora decks and for Spell Victor, but you are playing virtually the slowest deck in the game at this point. You want to slow the game to a crawl until you're just like in control. Sigil of the Storm allows you to tax your opponents some power for when they conquer, and there are a lot of conquer decks. So if you're removing stuff that's on battlefields, you make your opponent have to reconquer it, they lose some more power, and it can add up to losing, 2 to 3 runes a game, which is not nothing. And by the time that you go to it, you kind of don't care anymore. And then your third battlefield, Vile Maw, effectively doesn't really matter to you, exactly like Viktor. You just jam units in there like your recruits, and they sit there, and if you lose them, you lose them. But it prevents your opponent, especially if they're on purple cards, from retreating back to base. So this shuts down cards like Flash. People can't fight or flight their units back. They can technically ride them to another battlefield, but they can't ride them back either. So in certain cases, it's going to cause some big headaches for your opponent who's trying to get out. And also, no, I think that's it actually. Theoretically, no, never mind. I was trying to think of some other cases, but I think that's really like the purpose of this is you just don't feel the brunt of Vile Maws as opposed to your opponent, who is really going to feel it most of the time. Or if neither of you does, then it's just a blank battlefield, which is not the worst thing in the game. So one of the questions I think when looking at Lux is asking, why do I want to play Lux as opposed to Viktor? There's a secondary question, which is like, why do I want to play Lux as opposed to Renata? But Renata at least has some like very different deck quirks that I think merit their own video with how you can play for point with her champion unit. So the question is to really look at the Lux and Viktor decks, because the current spell lists look quite similar. So if you consider Lux and Viktor on kind of like a left-right axis, and you consider the current Vanguard Armory, like Spiritforged build, versus the older, like Bloom Burrow, small spell build, you're going to notice that there's different axes. And what Vanguard Armory gives you is inevitability. It's really hard to compete with a card that would generate 3 different units every turn, especially when you're removing units of comparable size. So that's what it produces, right? Cards like Bloom Burrow, not Bloom Burrow, Raven Bloom, rewarded you for playing small spells so that you could very narrowly get above your opponent with cards like Stupefy, and then you could like score with very minimal investment. So really an axis between efficiency and inevitability. And so the newer versions clearly are trying to go down the route of having inevitability. Now, what does Lux provide that Viktor doesn't? Well, Lux provides more card draw, and card draw multiplies inevitability, right? It is going all in on the Vanguard Armory combo. It's why you don't really have much of another finisher, is because the deck just says, I'm going to play spells and eventually I'm going to find one of these. And when I find it, I'm going to win, or you're going to remove it. And I'm going to have to go back to my plan to find the second one and then maybe the third one. You probably don't want to play 2 Vanguard Armories on the board just in case your opponent thermos. But in general, that's kind of like the draw, so to speak. Whereas Viktor provides pressure, right? Viktor provides constant unit pressure early, which kind of decouples you slightly from the Vanguard Armory plan, where you can say, well, I can just remove stuff and jam a 1-cost unit, And maybe I will just hold this point and get like 2-3 points, and then eventually I might play Vanguard Armory. Viktor just likes Vanguard Armory, but is not as devoted to simply finding that. And so my question really is going to be, A, which one of these champions do you have on hand? So if you have Viktor, you can just play like a Viktor recruit list, and that's going to be fine. Or if you have both, then you can decide what you want. And if you're somebody who's going to regionals, then obviously metal cards play into this. So there is a reason to play Lux aside from the quirks of the deck. But this is generally how I would consider like the flavor split of these. And I personally think that Lux offers some very interesting play lines. Perhaps not as on the face strong as Viktor, but nevertheless still got through a field of like 450 something players. So I'm going to talk about the emerging deck list. So I feel like this is less a core build than it is the one that we're seeing pop up. So this is the 36th place Lux from the Dalian Open. If you want, you can go look at last week's VOD, and you're going to see how the deck played out. And you're going to see what happens when the deck kind of struggles to find its footing a little bit. I think that matchup had some misplays, but also had like some legitimate like trouble with the deck working out the way it needed to. But really, you can take a look at it, and you're going to notice a ton of removal. You're going to notice some cost mitigation with Seal and Card Sharp, and the Vanguard Jace combo, along with one Progress Day, which I think is super spectacular with Lux. You get to draw 5 cards for 6, and then Time Warp. So this is pretty much it. And the sideboard has some additional recruit production if you are either in like a linear matchup or you just can't target as much with removal for some reason. You've got an additional salvage to bring that up to 3 if you're against like a super gear heavy deck or in the mirror. Blood Money is out of the main, which I'm like okay with, but I feel like I like Blood Money a lot if you're playing Jace combo. Unchecked Power as a one-off is kind of spectacular. Basically, you never want to double draw it, but if you're in a matchup where you need to clear your opponent off of points, and they're sitting with like big boards and they're stacking, then unchecked just like is an absolute beating. I think we're gonna have to see if the Western meta is as big on stacking as the Chinese meta is, but I feel like it will hit a bit less here. But having one of in the sideboard is fine. And inversely, Divine Judgment punishes like people who are holding a ton of cards and a ton of resources. So often this will be like pretty brutal against decks that are like just drawing a ton, right? So think like a green deck, for example, is going to feel the brunt of this like pretty hard. But also decks that develop super wide. So yeah, I think that's the logic of this list, and I think the list probably plays pretty solidly, and on the face of it, does not seem insanely expensive with the exception of Time Warp. Seals are going down a little bit, and Jace is up in the air, and Vanguard Armory is going to be an uncommon. So there's really like not a ton in here that's going to cost for now. Bellows Breath I'm slightly concerned with, but we'll see. And then you have like a budget version of this, which I really just downgraded the 36th best placing deck. So you cut the Seals and you cut the Time Warp, and you replace it with Blood Money straight up. Blood Money will generate you some gold, or sometimes even 2 gold if you're using it on your own stuff. So you're going to get to produce some of the value that you'd get out of the Seals. You lose access to Time Warp, which really there is no equivalent effect. So unfortunately, it is what it is. And then the side, I like having some Honest Brokers in for more gold. I think I would side Honest Brokers in and cut something like Wages if the matchup is ill-suited for it. Salvage, same thing, is fine. Recruit, the Vanguard spell is like another way to generate more tokens. Again, if you're against decks that have heavy ward. And Blast of Power is sort of like your Miser's fourth copy of Dragunder. So it's less good, but if you are on it, you can have a little bit more unconditional removal if you need it. So listen, a lot of these cards are priced weirdly because of Lux's cost as a champion to acquire, and the Spiritforged cards are basically like unpriced. What we have right now in terms of budget, about $50 for the budget version, about $150 for the non-budget version. The lion's share of that is Time Warp. I can tell you that. So I wouldn't fuss too much about it. I think Time Warp is a card that when you see it, it either tends to be like a total brick or it tends to win you the game. And there are ways where you can just like play something else for now and then upgrade to it if you feel like the deck really speaks to you. The other thing I want to talk about really quickly is kind of like considering this as a future proof, right? So right now, Viktor is marginally behind Fiora in terms of being fifth, and has had some pretty good, like 151 top 8 placements for 902 tournament appearances. Fiora's appearance rate is much better, I think, which should tell you a little bit about what's happening with Viktor, which is like Viktor does well into like Kaisa and Draven, but struggles into Aurelia, Fiora, and some of the other green decks, and Rek'Sai, although there's not, like a bajillion Rek'Sais. But you can also notice that like Viktor is playable at a fraction of the budget that the other decks are playable at. So my advice, if you're not somebody who is like absolutely trying to just train up for a skirmish immediately, is feel free to play this. And then feel free to trade from Lux to Viktor, or if you want the Lux Metal card and you're going to an event, then stick with Lux. But just be aware that like the field is a bit weird right now. There was also like a state of the game article that just came out that I'm not going to talk about right now. I'm going to talk about it next week. But the idea of like power erratas was thrown out of the window by Dave Guskin. And now we're talking, for now, nothing is going to change. But if something were to change, it would be bans. And so it's kind of hard to predict what's going to happen with blue-yellow's equity into the field because the cards that it is intended to prey on might get banned. At which point you would see like a shift in the meta towards something else. So this is just my 2 cents. And I think you can reasonably pick up Lux or, side grade a Lux deck that you already have with the Spiritforged cards, and then figure out if you want to be, Vanguard Armory Lux or the classic like blue Lux or even the Viktor, and you can like operate in that like tier 2, tier 3 Dark Horse space without having to like fight other people for chase cards, which is a space that I like being in. So that's kind of it for Lux. A hero that I wasn't like super taking a look at until I was getting ready for this video, but that I find myself pretty enthused by now, actually. So hopefully I do not run into one of you at a skirmish and lose to an all removal pile, because that would make me unhappy. So yeah, I think that's it for today. So next week we have, I either have to do 1 episode or 2 to really wrap up the Origins in Focus episodes. We are like moving on to Spiritforged in full finally, and then I'm reasonably sure that the non-champion video is going to be talking about how metas evolve and how it has been evolving, and especially like how that works or what the theory behind meta is. So I'm thinking about it. We'll see if that's what ends up happening. Anyways, again, good luck at your pre-rifts for those of you who are going, and I will see you on the other side.